Everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello to this talk on Some Jews Get Along and Some Don't, under the auspice of the Merowitz Center. Please check out the center's website, e-blast, and Facebook page for information about interesting and varied upcoming programs. My name is Brenda Peerless. I'm a member of the Merowitz Center Advisory Council and a congregant of Congregation Sher Emeth. It is my honor to welcome all of you and introduce you to our presenter, Rabbi Jeffrey Stiffman, the beloved and highly revered Rabbi Emeritus of Sher Emeth. I have known Rabbi Stiffman for over 40 years. He also bar mitzvahed and bat mitzvahed our children, as well as renewing our vows with us on our 25th wedding anniversary. Rabbi Stiffman received his undergraduate degree from Loyola College and was ordained in 1965 at the Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, Ohio. He earned his PhD in theology in 1972. He served as assistant rabbi of Sher Emeth from 1965 to 1968. And after working briefly in a congregation in his hometown of Baltimore for 18 months, he returned to St. Louis in Sher Emeth as senior rabbi in 1971. He served in that capacity until his retirement in 2004, when he was named Rabbi Emeritus. A man of many interests, he not only made history during his tenure as senior rabbi, but has been a faithful chronological of the history as reflected in the book, most notably published on the history of Congregation Sher Emeth to mark the 150th anniversary of the congregation. And it's very interesting if you haven't read it. I've already started reading some of it when we got a copy. Rabbi, we look forward to your talk with us today. And I just want to say, Rabbi Stiffman has a great sense of humor.
Thank you, Brenda. Some people think so. My children and grandchildren don't, but that's okay. They suffer more with it. Thank you, everybody. It's so wonderful to see so many familiar faces. Some who I haven't seen for a while. Some are still pictures, and some look like telephones. So it's wonderful to see you all here and to share with you. One disclaimer. I'm going to talk to some extent about the differences between American Jews who came from Germany and American Jews who came from Eastern Europe. And some might feel that there's a prejudice one way or another. So I want you to know that you can't accuse me because I'm a half-breed. My mother's family came from German Jewish stock. My father's family came from Eastern European stock. Of course, my German grandmother told me that her daughter married beneath her station because she married an Eastern European Jew. And I said, but Grandma, if they hadn't married, I wouldn't be here. She said, yeah, that's right. Anyway, I'd like to share with you some thoughts and some memories about very early Jewish history in St. Louis and how we came to be the community that we are today. My talk will mainly deal with the early times of St. Louis Jewish history. And what led me to this was the book that Brenda mentioned before, which is available at Sher Emeth for $30 a copy, in which I studied the history of our congregation through almost 3 years ago now, through its 150th year. And it was a congregation that I'll discuss at more length in a little while, that was founded as the first Reformed congregation in St. Louis. And there used to be lots of arguments about firsts. When I first came here, Rabbi Groman of blessed memory of UH and Rabbi Klausner of blessed memory of B'nai El used to argue which was the first synagogue west of the Mississippi here in St. Louis. And I'll show you what we found as we discuss it. And of course, as you know, the old statement is where there's two Jews, there's three opinions. And the question is, how we get along and how we don't get along. So I'd like to start by beginning at the very beginning of Judaism in St. Louis, and want to share with you some pictures as long as I'm talking as well. So the title is Some Jews Get Along and Some Don't, Early St. Louis Jewry. And this is a way of sharing how we started and where we are today. Okay. Now, does this look familiar to you? It should look familiar, but it didn't look this way when the first Jew came to St. Louis. As far as we know, the first Jew who came to St. Louis was a man by the name of Joseph Phillipson. He came in 1807, and he opened a store. He and two brothers owned stores in the East, and he opened a store of different types of goods at 6 North Main Street. Which is what you're looking at now was, of course, then not the Arch grounds. According to his records, which we have, some of his customers included Alexander McNair, who became the first governor of Missouri, Auguste and Pierre Choteau, Meriwether Lewis, and many people who were outfitting for government expeditions. And interestingly enough, he also started brewing beer. He wasn't the first, he was the third or fourth brewer in St. Louis, but started this wonderful tradition of brewing beer in St. Louis. One of his brothers came later on and opened another store next to his, and they became very well known in the city. We're not sure how long they stayed, but this much we know. He had nothing to do with any organized Judaism because there wasn't any at that time. And as far as we know, he identified as a Jew. Most of the settlers did in those days, openly identified as a Jew, but never worked towards developing a Jewish community. We then jump ahead from 1807 to the early 1830s. And here we find the Arch also very important. In 1836, the first minyan was held in St. Louis. It was held, according to records, above Max's grocery store. Above Max's, they rented a room for parties, weddings. I don't think they had any bar mitzvahs or brises then. And a group of Jews decided to have their first minyan on Rosh Hashanah. There weren't 10 Jewish men in town who were interested, evidently, so a bunch of merchants who were going through town and knew they were going to be here on the high holy days asked to be part of a minyan. A man named Mr. Baumeister bought a Sefer Torah and high holiday prayer books, Machzorim, at his own expense. He brought them from New York so that they could have a minyan. We're not sure how often that minyan met, but we're told that a few years later, when it became a regular minyan, they often couldn't get a 10th man. And one day they pulled an Irishman in and said, "You'll be the 10th man." And he liked it so much that he became a regular member of this minyan.
He converted.
In 1840, two men bought a cemetery near where Choteau Avenue is today, Choteau and Jefferson, actually. This often was marked as the beginning of a Jewish community. My great teacher, Dr. Jacob Marcus of blessed memory, told us as we studied American Jewish history, a lot of times when Jews settled in a place, the first thing they bought was a cemetery, which they might have needed, and then they eventually developed a synagogue. The cemetery at Pratt and Jefferson remained there until 1868, And then it moved out way, way far out in the country to University City at North and South Roads. And it later became United Hebrew Cemetery, which we all know today. It was way, way out then. In 1841, we have our first congregation founded. It's called United Hebrew Congregation. Oh, so I messed up before I changed my slide. The first minyan, the store where the first minyan was held where approximately the old arch welcome desk was. Remember, you used to go in through here, but now there's a new entrance. But under there was a reception room. And when that was first built, there was a plaque placed there by the Rabbinical Association marking that as the site of the first minyan in St. Louis. Somehow through all the renovations, the plaque is gone, but we still remember it. I'm sure that everybody who goes through the Arch Museum remembers that the first minyan was there. That's supposed to be funny. Another Jewish site. This is the new Bush Stadium in all of its glory before the pandemic. It's very important to us as well because the first building that was built by United Hebrew Congregation, and we do not have a picture of that first temple building, but that first congregation was built where home plate is in our new stadium. So if you see a bunch of men in taluses and yarmulkes davening there, you'll know what it is. It's the ghosts of the founding of United Hebrew Congregation. United Hebrew Congregation at that time was totally Orthodox. They had, for example, a mikveh. They hired their own mole for circumcising children, and they had a congregational shochet, a kosher butcher. And he visited each family twice a week to see if they needed meat slaughtered for them, or they could order meat and the shochet would bring it to them. It was so Orthodox that in 1855, Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, who was the founder of Reform Judaism in America and who was centered in Cincinnati, came to visit St. Louis. He had a paper called The Israelite, which was like the national Jewish newspaper in America in the 1850s. And he had correspondents in all different cities, and he wanted to come to see St. Louis, and there was only the United Hebrew Congregation there. So he came to visit. They invited him to speak, and he spoke, and he left. And he wrote up afterwards, it was the coldest reception he had received in almost any city in the world. Because the community at that time, like many immigrant communities, came out of Orthodoxy and was mainly Orthodox. Their first building was Elise Baptist Church, and they did have a Rabbi Bernard Illoway from 1854 to 1855. As you can tell, he didn't have a long tenure. He was there for 1 year. Some of the people found him too Orthodox. Some found him not Orthodox enough, but most found that they didn't want to pay the salary for a rabbi, and he moved on. Incidentally, he had served for 2 years before then as a rabbi in my home temple in Baltimore, which at that time was also Orthodox. So I had seen his picture on the wall of my temple where I grew up as a past rabbi, and then I moved here and I saw his picture on the wall of United Hebrew. But he didn't have a long tenure. United Hebrew started to grow, and it reached 100 families, which was immense for those days, as the Jewish community pre-Civil War started to grow as well. Most of the Jewish immigrants who came to America between 1820 and 1870 were Jews who were fleeing Germany, Austria, Western Europe. There were a lot of revolutions in the 1840s, especially 1848, and a lot of people left these countries and came to America. And a lot of the Germans settled in the Midwest, Chicago, Milwaukee, Kansas City, Memphis, St. Louis. And these also became centers of Reform Judaism because some of the German Jews were Reform Jews, and we'll get to that a little later. However, even in Orthodoxy, there are differences. And UH became known as the Polish shul, even though its members were German Jews, because they followed a custom of prayers that had been very popular in Poland. Each country had their own minhag, their own customs with prayers, would leave out certain prayers, would add certain prayers, and they'd argue about it. So the United Hebrew became known as the Polish shul. Well, two other shuls were founded at that time, both of which were Orthodox. The first one was known as Congregational Emmanuel. Now, don't think of our modern Temple Emmanuel as the same one. This was entirely different. It was founded in 1847, and it became known as the German or the Bavarian congregation because a lot of the people came from Bavaria. It grew to some number of families. They followed a slightly different tradition. And in 1847, they were founded with a few families. Another congregation was founded in 1849. It was called Congregation B'nai B'rith. Now, again, don't get this mixed up with the fraternity, the group that we call B'nai B'rith, which was founded much later in the 1800s. This was a congregation of German Jews, most of whom came from Bohemia, a different part of Western Europe. And so they were called the Bohemian Shul. So we had the German Shul, we had the Polish Shul, and we had the Bohemian Shul. And in 1849, it was founded because UH was too intolerant in religious manners. In other words, it was very Orthodox, too Polish in habits and mannerisms. Hear that subtle dig at Polish Jews being lower in mannerisms than German Jews. And the biggest one of all, it was too exacting in financial demands. They demanded that people pay their dues and pay good dues. And so they founded a congregation B'nai B'rith. They rented a room which could hold 70 people. And as far as we know, they reached 30 families. And they purchased land for a cemetery on Gravois Avenue. Well, in 1849, there was a terrible cholera epidemic, which devastated St. Louis, and it devastated St. Louis Jewry. And both congregations, B'nai B'rith and Emmanuel, suffered so much that they shrunk in size. They couldn't afford to keep up their minions, their rented facilities, etc., and spoke at first with United Hebrew about merging into them, which would have been logical. Maybe there were 120 families left and 100 are already at UH. But they couldn't merge because Jews get along and Jews don't. The United Hebrew people insisted that they keep the Polish minhag, the Polish way of prayer, and the other two congregations didn't want that. So B'nai B'rith and Emmanuel merged, and they called their congregation B'nai El. You've heard of that name, I'm sure. And that occurred in 1852. It was a little more liberal than UH, but it was still Orthodox and became known as the Bohemian Shul, Bohemische Shul. So people didn't say, I'm going to Sheremet, or I'm going to UH, or I'm going to this or that. They went to the Polish shul or the German shul or the Bohemische shul. Um, they built a building, their first building at 6th and Sayre Avenue. And this is what it looks like. This is the picture of the first synagogue building of Bnei El, the first picture that we have of a synagogue built there. And people soon, being very religious, started calling it the coffee grinder or the coffee can or things such as that. But this was the first synagogue built in St. Louis, and it looks something like a fortress, doesn't it? At 6th and Sayre, between Gratiot and Sayre Avenues. They had financial difficulties at first and were ready to possibly merge into UH when they got a $3,000 bequest in the will of Judah Toro, who was a great Jewish leader in New Orleans and never married or had children and made a fortune and left money to a lot of Jewish organizations around town. And with the $3,000, they called off merger talks and completed the synagogue. And interestingly enough, they put a notice in the paper, and many Gentiles donated to the synagogue building fund because they felt it would be good to have a Jewish church in town. In 1859, United Hebrew built a brand new building at 6th Street, also between St. Charles and Locust Streets. So you can imagine where that was as well. During this time, up till the Civil War times, the German Jews many of them became very successful. Yes, there were poor ones, but many of them became extremely successful, became merchants, became bankers, became dealers in grain and other commodities, and started moving west. And they became established as full Americans. Many of them intermarried. Some of them converted out of Judaism, but many of them were looking for a more liberal form of Judaism than offered by UH and Bnei El at the time. During the Civil War, the Jewish community was divided. Some fought for the Confederacy, some fought for the Union. And it became very controversial. The community still wasn't developed as a community. We didn't have a federation. We didn't have organizations of synagogues. We didn't have a hospital. We didn't have a lot of communal institutions. And the first challenge came in 1855 when the city passed what we call the Blue Laws, that you couldn't have your business opened on Sunday because that was the Sabbath. And some of the members of the community got together and fought it in court and had the city charter amended to say that you must keep your store closed on Sunday unless you observe the Sabbath on another day. And some of the Jewish merchants closed on Saturday and opened on Sunday. Okay, we come now to my congregation, Sheremeth, and we have learned that in 1867, a group of Bnei El members were dissatisfied with the slow pace of reform and wanted something a little more modern, in keeping with modern sensibilities and understandings of science and history. And so they formed what they called the Temple Association. And at first, members of Bnei El welcomed them and said you can retain dual membership, etc. But a group of them formed the Temple Association and raised money to build a temple. And in 1869, the first Sheremeth was built at 17th and Pine. That corner recently came into prominence. If you look at the man standing on the left, that's where the 7-Eleven that was burned down during the recent demonstrations stood. And I used to take the kids when we went on our tour of the history of Sheremeth in 5th grade and told them that there was a very important religious monument there, a 7-Eleven. Anyway, this was considered the farthest west sections of St. Louis. It was founded by German Jews, and it looks sort of like maybe a mosque with double minarets. It was in the Turkish style that was used very often for synagogues then, considered a quote, Oriental style. It was dedicated with tremendous ceremony. And they had, the Masons came, the mayor, the governor, the bishop, the religious leaders, and the rabbis of all the other congregations that were existing in 1867. And they had a ceremony that began at 3 and ended at 5:30 when they had the Shabbos services. And so people were in synagogue for about 4 hours. 17th and Pine became a great center of Judaism, and people flocked to Sheremeth. I won't go into the whole history. That's a lecture in and of itself. Jews, however, started to move west. And in 1897, Sheremeth moved to Lindell and Vandevetter. This is the corner of Lindell and Vandevetter. It's the southeast corner. If you would look past the building on the right, looking down Vandevetter, you would see, what's the big, I'm blanking on the big store from Sweden, the IKEA. Thank you, Arlene. IKEA. You can't see IKEA from here. This was 1879. This was from a postcard that was sold. It looks much like a church, right? Our Reform forebears wanted to assimilate. They wanted to be accepted as Americans. And this building sort of looked like a church. We have absolutely no pictures of the interior of either synagogue. Although there was a description written, and about 40 years ago, one of our confirmation students drew the inside of the synagogue from the descriptions that were written, but we don't have that synagogue. And Rabbi Samuel Sale was there for many years, from the late 1890s until 1929. As you can imagine, Lindell Boulevard still is a great looking boulevard. And this is where the German Jews moved. They moved uptown and they moved south. And this was a pattern that Reformed Jews followed since then. For example, I'm sorry, this was our third building. I'll get back to there in a minute. This is our third building, which many of you still see in U City at Delmar and Trinity. It's now WashU's WashU's musical performance school. And it's really interesting to me because when I was a teenager, my parents had a car just like the one that's in front, 3 colors, and I loved it. Okay, other groups moved south. And here you have Congregation B'nai El. Okay, does it look like a temple? Now, if you go there, it's condos after many years as a temple. It was, I'm looking up the address. I don't see what I did with it. Okay, but it's in South St. Louis in the Compton Heights neighborhood. So a lot of German Jews, especially the liberals who escaped the European revolutions, moved to South St. Louis with the other Germans. They felt comfortable. And you should know that in Sheremeth's first building, it was only the last few years that the rabbis started to give sermons in English. All the prayer books and all of the sermons were given in German. And similarly at B'nai El, when they started within South St. Louis, there was it was only given in German to show you how far south many of the Jews lived at that time. Temple Israel, which broke off from Sheremeth in the 1890s because Sheremeth fired their rabbi and he took a group of people and formed Temple Israel, formed this magnificent building. Some of you might remember it at Kings Highway and Washington Avenue. They called it Holy Corners because there were 4 places of worship on each of the corners. And when they were still there, they used to have Holy Corners dinners and did a lot of interfaith work. This looks more like a Greek temple, right? More classical. But this was also, if only by a few blocks south of Del Mar. Okay. Then we start with the more traditional congregations. Starting in the 1870s, thousands and thousands of Jews started arriving in America from Russia. Many of us remember the story. The Tsar announced that he wanted to get rid of the Jews. So he wanted to kill a third, get a third to emigrate, and a third put into the Pale of Settlement, which was a section of what was Russia at that time, which was not the most desirable area in which to live. And millions of Jews came to America between 1872 and 1924 when the immigration laws against Jews were passed. And you had a whole group of Eastern Europeans coming, and many of them formed their own synagogues. The St. Louis Genealogical Society has a Jewish interest group, and they compiled a list of many of the synagogues that were formed. Some of them lasted 4 or 5 years. Some of them lasted 30 or 40 or 50 years. Many of them were what we call Landsmannschaft synagogues. People came from a certain city or area in Europe and wanted to keep up the traditions that they had. So they formed a synagogue. One was known as the Bialystoker Shul, people who came from Bialystok. Others were known by different names. Almost all of the Orthodox synagogues came west, north of Olive, north of Del Mar. This was the Del Mar divide that we talk about today between the richer and poorer neighborhoods in St. Louis, and it happened the same way between the German Jews and the Eastern European Jews who couldn't afford Lindell Boulevard, but might afford Goodfellow, et cetera. So here we have an early Base Abraham at Goodfellow and Wells. Looks like maybe they took over a house, right? And formed a synagogue. Here we have B'nai Amunah, Academy and Vernon. And let's remember that B'nai Amunah started as an Orthodox synagogue. And, but it had a lot of German Orthodox Jews in it. And when later on in the 1800s, there was a group of synagogues that was formed, it was made up of United Hebrew, B'nai El, Sheremeth, and B'nai Amunah. So they cooperated even though they differed. And I just wonder, you know, knowing of the laws that we have today of accessibility, how the old people got up to pray at the old B'nai Amunah. No ramps, no elevators, etc. Here's the old Sharasetic, which looks very impressive. I only moved to St. Louis in '65, so I never saw any of these. But once again, Page Boulevard and West End Avenue. This evidently was taken after they left, and it became a church. Another example, Chesed Shalemeth, Euclid and Page. it looks sort of churchy, but this was founded as an Orthodox synagogue, and we know that they founded the cemetery at Olive and Hanley. Then they moved on to North and South Boulevard, if you'll remember, the Chesed Shalem Shul. They also opened the Cemetery West, way out west, on White Road. And they eventually went out of business. At that time, the chief rabbi of St. Louis was also the rabbi of the Chesed Shalem Shul. And Rabbi Rifkin of blessed memory, who was a very, very sweet and kind man who reached out to all Jews, insisted that when they prayed, they had to pray certain prayers in certain ways. And remember, this is how the Bohemian and the German and the Bavarian shuls argued back in the 1850s. He insisted that the prayers every Shabbos include certain prayers. The leaders of the congregation disagreed because they had been praying in a different way. So they came to a parting of the ways, which is a nice way to say they fired him. And he left as their rabbi, and a number of their members left and went to the other synagogues in the area, Beis Abraham, Young Israel, etc. And the shul went out of business, but they were taken over by what's called the U City Shul now. So even today, even in modern times, even within Orthodox Judaism, we couldn't always talk with each other, and we couldn't always get along. Where there are two Jews, there are three opinions. As we look at this history, we think of it coming almost to today. And what did we see? We saw a pattern of the German Jews, many of whom had become more affluent, and let's not forget that many of them were very poor, coming in the 1840s and afterwards and building fairly large, fairly extensive synagogues as they come up the southern corridor. And think even when I came here of UH with that gorgeous building overlooking the park, which is now the Missouri Historical Society Museum. Boy, were they lucky to get that. And you had Sher sitting at an important corner of Delmar and Trinity, and Temple Israel having moved out already to Creve Coeur. You had B'nai El moving from Delmar and Clara out to Highway 40 Outer Road. And you had B'nai Amuna and Shaare Zedek also moving close to Delmar Boulevard. And a lot of the Orthodox congregations in the Loop area, and then moving farther up, again, the corridor north of Delmar and north of Olive. But interesting things happened. Even in this time, disagreements took place. For example, when B'nai El's beloved rabbi, retired Bertram Klasner after many years as senior rabbi, they brought in a new rabbi who only lasted a couple years. And a bunch of the members of B'nai El loved that rabbi. The majority didn't, and the board fired him. And a bunch of members started Congregation Kol Am, which was designed to be a new congregation to go with the rabbi who had been fired. Well, the rabbi who had been fired was smart enough to know that that was not a good idea and left, got his own congregation elsewhere. And Kol Am had a series of young rabbis hoping that it would grow to a larger size, which unfortunately it didn't, and eventually went out of business. Similarly, B'nai El tried to survive on Outer 40 Road, and as the membership went down, finally realized that they were no longer financially viable and folded into my congregation, Sher Emeth. There have been a number of mergers. Certainly, the merger of Brit Sholem and Knesset Israel congregations took place, and they became BSKI. And then as the membership of BSKI and Shari Zedek went down, they merged to form Kol Rina. So you could almost have a family tree of where congregations went and where they're going. But today I'm happy to tell you, and I'll end here so we can have time for questions and discussions. For those of you who are lifelong St. Louis, since I've only been here 55 years, might have other things to add to it. As the Jewish population moved west, the synagogues had to move with them. I inherited the senior rabbi position of Sheremeth, just as our congregation was bitterly divided as to whether to move or not. And those of you who are Sheremeth members remember the bitterness of some of the families who didn't want us to move, and the bitterness of some of the families who wanted to move when it was voted down the first time and then voted up the second time. So where there are Jews, where there are two Jews, there are three opinions. Some rabbis disagree and say there are 5 or 6 or 7. But the history of St. Louis, interestingly enough, has brought us to the present day. And I must tell you that in the present day, there is a lot more cooperation. There is a lot more sense of unity as Jews in St. Louis realize that the numbers are going down in terms of congregational affiliation. And it's important for us to continue our people and our lives as Jews and to develop a Jewish community. And I should mention, just in ending, that there is one group that all the rabbis of St. Louis are invited to, not only Reform and Conservative like the Rabbinical Association, but also Orthodox rabbis who belong to the Rabbinical Council. And that's under the auspices of the Jewish Federation, which was originally founded by German Jews to help settle the Eastern European Jews. Jewish Hospital was founded by German Jews to help the poor have a place to go, because if you had any money, you didn't dare go into a hospital, your doctor came to you. All of the Jewish organizations that we know of today were founded to help each other, and that continues even today. So I'm going to stop here. And how do we, Brenda, or I don't know who's in charge now, do we take questions through chat, or can people unmute themselves and ask the question?
They can do either. So I'll be
Okay.
on the watch and I'll help you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. If someone has a question.
Harvey has a question.
Just a comment. Excuse me. You brought back memories, Rabbi, because my grandparents belonged to the temple, the synagogue on the Beth Israel, whatever, I can't remember the name that you showed. They were Russian, and they lived about 6 blocks away. And when I went there with them, Bubby went upstairs. And Grandpa stayed down.
Uh-huh.
I remember
Yep.
that.
Yes, a lot of people have told me stories about the shuls they went to. A number of them told me they went to Rabbi Blitz's cheder, and he twisted their ears if they were girls, if they made a mistake, or rapped their knuckles with a ruler if they were boys. His grandson, Niles, who's named after him, he was Rabbi Naftali Blitz, is a wonderful massage guy. I get massages for him before the pandemic. And he told me that a lot of people told him poems that they wrote about Rabbi Blitz. I won't repeat it because it's not all very nice, and they remembered that. So there was a very vibrant traditional life in North St. Louis and St. Louis County at that time. I think, did Linda, somebody said, Linda had a,
Rabbi, this is Barbara Sandmel. How are
Hi,
you?
Barbara.
I sort of feel like I have a connection to Sheremoth because my grandparents were longtime members there, my mother, but my father's side of the family were longtime Temple Israel members. And
Oh, that was an intermarriage, huh?
yes. and so, but I remember I was too young in 1955 when this happened, but I grew up at Temple Israel when they moved west and how they had to sue the city of Creve Coeur to be able to move a temple in there. And if Temple Israel had not done that successfully, Sheremoth wouldn't be where it is today either.
Yes.
So there was a big fight about that.
You're absolutely right. That was not only local, but that was had national impact as well. And we thank Temple Israel for doing it. Incidentally, Temple Israel broke off because our first Rabbi Zoneshine was very, very controversial, and he quit, and they fired him, and he came back, and it was a whole mess. So he left and formed Temple Israel. And 100 years later, we had a special Shabbat evening where the Temple Israel came to Sheremoth to worship for Shabbat evening. I think maybe Charlie Eisenkram will remember, or Harvey. I think Alice Fleischer Davis Schwartz was the president, and we had a symbolic hatchet. And at the ceremony, we buried the hatchet between Sheremoth and Temple Israel. Rabbi Rubin was wonderful, and we had a wonderful time sharing them together. And at that program, I did thank Temple Israel for paving the way for us to get into Creve Coeur. Harvey?
Okay.
Harvey?
Yes, Jeff, thanks for your great presentation. I have a question. Historically, we thought that congregations had to be located in areas where its members live. However, 30 years or so ago, CRC made an exception. Is that a common practice, or is the proximity to members still in vogue?
Well, there are two aspects of this. If you're an Orthodox congregation, you have to be within walking distance of your members. So for example, there's a large Orthodox community in West University City. And right near me, there are three shuls. There's the Aguda, there's Chabad, and there's Young Israel, all within like almost on three corners of a four-corner area. So if it's an Orthodox synagogue, it's a necessity. If it's a Reform or to some extent conservative synagogue, you want to be located where your people are. Now, Central Reform Congregation was the exception, and they went to an area where Jews had lived and where they felt young Jews were going to move back, and they were right. And they moved back into the city and have been very, very successful in becoming a very important force within the city of St. Louis and within that area. In my hometown of Baltimore, a similar congregation was formed in the old building of a conservative congregation that moved out in the 1950s, and they are similarly very urbanly attached. So there is a movement of young Jews back into cities all across the country, and it'll be interesting to see how many congregations like CRC will develop or have developed in those cities.
Janice Sherman?
Yeah. I have a comment and a question. So I grew up in St. Louis, and up until the age of 5, I lived at Goodfellow and Minerva. And a block away at Goodfellow, and I think it was Romaine, they called it the Romanischer Shul.
Romanischer Shul, right.
So I was thinking, I guess that was because it was at that shul, but I was wondering, did it have some other name?
Yes, it did have another name. It was founded mainly by Jews who came from Romania. So it was called the Rumänische Schule. I don't have my chart in front of me, but I'll get it for you. It did have a Hebrew name as well.
Okay.
Mhm.
And then, on the high holidays, we would walk to various shuls and visit people who were,
Mhm.
standing around outside, and one of which was Base Abraham.
Uh-huh.
And its current location, I don't think that was I believe there was another shul there,
Yes.
maybe Tiferes Israel
The
or
Ferris
something,
Israel Chevra Kadisha was the shul there.
before Base Abraham
Right.
came there.
Base
Okay.
Ab- when I first came here, it was Tiferes Israel Chevra Kadisha with Rabbi Hartman, who was a brilliant scholar. And he used to come into our library, the Rabbi Julius Gordon Library, to study because we had a full set of Talmud that was given to us by the government, had been printed for the troops during World War II. And they had a bunch of them left over. We had it in our library. So he would come over all the time and study in our library. Tiferes, Base Abraham at that point was in the shul on Delmar Boulevard, just east of Skinker,
I remember
that had
that.
originally been Chevra Kadisha
Okay.
and then became Base Abe. And when Chevra Kadisha moved out, Base Abraham moved west. And I was invited to take part in that. So we went down to the old Base Abe, and they had 6 or 7 Torahs, and somebody had a flatbed truck. And 6 or 7 of these old guys, I mean, they seemed really old to me. Now I'm 81, they don't seem so old anymore. Each carrying a Torah, sat in the back of that truck and brought the Torah scrolls up to Base Abe, to the new Base Abe. And I had never been in it all those years. I didn't realize they had tremendous steps to walk. Again, how the old guys made it up the steps,
Well, the
And then I-
Rumänische Shield had huge steps. I mean,
Yeah,
it had
yeah.
it was real high before you got to the
I think
main
they,
sanctuary.
yeah. So anyway, I brought greetings on behalf of Sherameth and Rabbi Lipnick, I think if I remember correctly, on behalf of B'nai Amunah to our new neighbors. And Rabbi Eichenstein, of blessed memory, the chief rabbi, gave this speech, and he said, may Base Abraham live to 120 more years, and blah, 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 blah. And as we're walking out, I said to him, Rabbi, that was such a beautiful speech from your mouth to God's ears. And he turned to me, he said, Jeff, I hope it lasts another 10 years. Because the community was moving out, and Base Abe really showed them. They attracted the Wash U crowd. They attracted the more liberal University City Orthodox crowd. And they're a very active, very dynamic congregation. And I also think that Rabbi Eichenstein would be pleased as well. At that point, it looked like every single Jew in University City was going to move out. There was such a movement. Yeah, so that's covered. Yeah. Other people had questions?
Terry's Leper has
Yeah.
a question.
Yes.
Yes, I have a question. Wait, yeah. If Rabbi Hartman was so smart, why didn't he warn me when I married my wife?
I'll tell you, there have been a couple times when I've been asked to officiate a wedding, and I met with the bride and groom ahead of time a couple times, and I felt like saying, this ain't going to work out. But there have been times when what they call premarital counseling, when I've suggested to a couple that they might want to see a professional marriage counselor to work out their issues. But are you happy?
It's 59 years.
Okay, well, that's good. We got a year
I've been
on you.
I'm married 59 years. You asked me how many years I've been happy. 2.5.
What was the old Henny Youngman joke? We've been married 50 years. It's the best 3 years of my life.
My
Right?
life, yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. He was smart then, wasn't he?
Yeah, I guess. I'll
The
give
one-
it to him.
He was a wonderful man. His brother was the founder of the Hartman Institute in Israel.
Oh,
A wonderful, great place where a lot of rabbis from St. Louis have studied. Other
Stanford?
questions?
Thank you. Mhm.
Stanford has a question?
Okay. I've been to, hi, Rabbi Stiffman. I've been
Hi.
to some shows on the East Coast, older ones, and they were like theater in the round. Were any of these older synagogues in St. Louis like that?
Well, we don't have a lot of pictures of the inside of the Orthodox shuls. But as you know, the traditional synagogue, the reader stand is in the center of the men's section because the reader faces the ark as well as the people. Reform Judaism changed it when we were founded in the 18 teens to more of the style of a theater or a church, because the churches had altars, where the clergy faced the people. And the early reformers wanted it that way because they felt more aesthetic, more modern, and that your leader led you in prayer. And of course, in the German synagogues, everything was done properly and in proper order and on time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So usually the male worshipers surrounded the reader stand. The women were, of course, up in the back, or if there was side balconies along the side as well. So I'm not sure about in the round or not. It certainly looked like that first B'nai congregation at 6th and Sayre was round. Whether that was the whole shul or just part of it, I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Brenda?
Yeah, I've got a question.
Before we have any more questions, I would like to thank Rabbi Stiffman on behalf of everyone on the Zoom program. It was very interesting. And to show what a wonderful guy he was, when our first child was born, it was a boy, and he came to the hospital to do a bris. He got out of bed with a bad back. I don't know if you remember that. It's almost 40 years ago.
Wow.
And my grandmother said to me afterwards, "You sure picked the right temple and rabbi to join."
Oh, wonderful.
Great.
And then he did our daughter's naming.
Yep.
Wonderful. Yes. I had a
Continue.
question,
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes. Richard Goldenhirsch, my brother-in-law and son-in-law, sister-in-law, the Liebrocks were members of Share Emmett for years and years.
Certainly.
And I've fond memories of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you had included in your study anything about the temples in the East St. Louis Belleville area.
I knew you were going to ask that, your rabbi, your honor, as soon as I heard the name. This particular talk was mainly about the movement in St. Louis, but of course the metro area, your area, was very important to the history of Judaism in the area, and it's a very interesting study. I will tell you that in terms of Sher Emeth, we are grateful that Agudas Achim's rabbi for a while was Rabbi Mordechai Nodell, the father of my predecessor, Rabbi Julius Nodell. And had it not been for Agudas Achim, maybe he never would have been here. So we have that tie, and there were many, many family ties. When I first came here, we had a number of East Siders, and you have to understand that I have a special place in my heart for the East Side because my first student pulpit was in Cairo. And
oh, wonderful.
I made friendships there that continue to this very day through the Rubin family. Jaime Rubin was president of the congregation there, and his son and daughter-in-law are here. We have the Hyman Rubin Library in his memory, the Rubin Scholars, etc. And so the East Side always had a special place in my heart. Ida Stack used to have the camp on the east side, Ben Frankel, and many of our kids, including my own, went there. So there have been great ties, and that ought to make an interesting study.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Honor.
Yes, Rabbi. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I have a comment. That was very educational, but I just wanted to say that I thought the Jewish population moved west because that's where the Chinese restaurants were.
That's a good comment. You know, the
That
old,
shows you how ignorant I am.
well, you might be right. Yeah.
Well, I didn't hear you. I didn't hear you mention anything. Like that.
You're right. I should have mentioned that. What was the old joke that the Chinese New Year, the Chinese counting of the New Year is 200 years later than the Jewish New Year. So what did the Jews do for the first 200 years when they went out to eat? Yeah.
And what are they going to do on Christmas?
Yeah, that's true. I could have held a minion. We were in Lulu's a year before last on Christmas. Could have held a service right then.
So Rabbi,
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. I think we've got most of the questions answered. I'm not
Great.
seeing anyone else.
Thank you very much, Judith, for taking good care of us.
Oh, you're welcome. And everyone have a great day. And we really, really appreciate the wonderful program that you provided for us today.
Thank you, Jeff.
thanks,
Thank
Judith.
you.
Thank
Thank you. I
Thank
see
you.
people from Florida and from Atlanta, and I don't know where else. Wonderful to see you all. Shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome.